I grew up in Britain in a Bangladeshi Muslim family. Some of the recent events, the recent public discourse, especially in relation to Brexit, I've personally found quite heartbreaking actually, because I grew up in the 90s under Tony Blair's, whole multiculturalist rhetoric, however shallow people think that might have been. And I grew up feeling really, really British and like, yay, we're all in this together. And then suddenly I felt like the tone of national discourse had totally changed. I suddenly felt like I wasn't welcome in this country. I suddenly felt like for some reason the national media, the tabloids, even politicians who were sort of giving in and capitulating to some of the xenophobic rhetoric that's been rising in Britain, a part of me almost felt like I'd suddenly been excluded, and suddenly I was a second-class citizen, and suddenly I wasn't represented in national rhetoric. And for me that's been really, really upsetting, and I've seen it carry on actually. I feel like it's getting worse and worse from some elements of our of the political realm, and something that I found quite heartbreaking actually was that last week I have a cousin, she's 13, she's so lovely, she's one of the sweetest people you ever meet, but she's been seeing all of this discourse sort of rising, this hate discourse, and she said, I'm not sure I want to live in this country anymore, and she's lived here all her life, and that was really heartbreaking for me. So one of the things that really motivates me and my political activism is trying to fight this discourse and find a way that we can change it, because actually Muslims in Britain belong here. And Hamid, you were saying, we've worked hard, all of this stuff, we've integrated in the community, but actually Muslims don't need to say those things. Muslims don't need to do those things to prove that they belong in Britain. They do belong in Britain. If you're born in Britain, if you migrated to Britain, you belong here. You're a citizen. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to be the good immigrant. So anyway, all that stuff makes me really, really passionate, and it's not what I intended to talk about, but I shall now move on to what is slightly more depressing. It is Islamophobia and the rise of the far right across Europe. So I'm really glad that we're here today to discuss this issue, because it's a very, very pressing issue and something that I think has been quite neglected, especially in public discourse, especially in Britain. And I think it's good that MPs like Syeda Warzi are now bringing it up to the forefront, and there needs to be a lot more. And Mariam, you referred to the definition of Islamophobia, and I think that's really important that that Britain moves forward with that. There are complex reasons behind the rise of Islamophobia. There are complex reasons behind racism, things to do with psychology and othering. There's a long history of racism, the history of imperialism as well, all feeds into this. Economic structures, global economic structures and exploitation feed into racism and Islamophobia. So today I'm going to focus on the rise of the far right specifically, and so that's a smaller element of a big topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really sorry to say that the situation globally and across Europe is grave. In the US, you have Donald Trump, who announced his Muslim ban, who's spewing hatred on Twitter about Muslims and anyone who is an immigrant, anyone whose skin colour is different. You have basically someone that I would describe as a fascist coming to power in Italy, Salvini. He said the streets need to be cleansed of migrants. He said Islam goes against the Italian constitution. You've had Marine Le Pen in France make it to the presidential runoffs. Her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was a collaborator of the Vichy regime in France. When he founded the Front National, one of their policies was to return to the colonization of Algeria. In Germany, you have the Alternative for Deutschland on the rise. They've broken Angela Merkel's grip on power. They have said that Islam has no place in Germany. They've called for the banning of minarets. They've called for the banning of the hijab. They've called for the banning of the call to prayer. You also have the far-right group Pegida, whose name is basically based against Islam. It completely identifies against Islam. It stands for Patriots, European Patriots Against the Islamization of the Occident. So these groups are really, really dangerous. They're really insidious, and they are slowly creeping into the mainstream and creeping into power across Europe. the list goes on. Hungary's Viktor Orban has a similar approach. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in Hungary as well. It's not just Islamophobia and hatred of Islam. You have Holocaust deniers as mayoral candidates. You have the campaign against George Soros. So these far-right parties are dangerous not just to Muslims, but to all groups, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual groups, as we saw in Poland, the mayor who was assassinated. And it's not just Europe, it's not just America, it's also in India. Narendra Modi was elected in 2014, predating Brexit, predating Trump, and he is part of the RSS, which is known by many to be a fascist organisation. Its history in the 1930s, they glorified Mussolini, they glorified Hitler, and he now has been elected as Prime Minister of a huge country of over 1 billion people, on a message of Hindutva, which is an ethnic religious nationalism which seeks for Hinduism to be the dominant ideology and culture in India, and which completely excludes anyone, including Muslims. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, India does have possibly one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. Mm-hmm. So this is really, really serious and really grave. And even China, the Uyghur Muslims are being put into concentration camps, and it's horrifying. And for me, Brexit is a really, really big issue in Britain, but I sit there and you watch the BBC and you watch Channel 4 and it's Brexit, 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 Brexit. But some of the things that are going on around the world, it almost seems purposeful that we don't get to see those things. So sometimes I watch Al Jazeera. I don't know if anyone watches that, and they do have a completely different perspective. But all media outlets have their pros and cons and their funding, and I won't go into that. Okay, so that's that is where we are today. And I know it's depressing, but I don't think it has to be depressing. And if we can understand what is going on, and if we can think about it, and if we can make connections, as you say, and links, and if we can build movements to fight this narrative and to change the picture and to put something positive forward, I think that this can be reversed and we can move into a better future. But first we must understand what is going on. So first of all, the far right is using Islamophobia, it's using migrant bashing to galvanise support amongst the population. Why is it so successful in doing this? Firstly, there's the wider political and economic context. In 2008, we had the financial crash, and the financial crash has shown, the financial crash has shown quite plainly that neoliberalism and capitalism have failed. They failed, the banking system failed, it was deregulated. Suddenly, governments found billions of pounds to bail out these the financial system. Following that, it had to be the ordinary taxpayer who had to foot the bill with austerity, while the banks continued to enrich themselves. And for ordinary people, the truth has been exposed. Suddenly, there's cuts to housing, there's cuts to the NHS, there's cuts to youth service, there's cuts to children's centres, and this is happening not just in Britain, but all across the globe. And people are really, really feeling, they're feeling the hit of these funding cuts, yet they have to pay for these financial services and these corporations who are getting away, evading taxes. So people have a sense that something is wrong with this system, and that's why everybody is aware that there's this massive backlash against the elites, etc. And these far-right groups, although they are mainly headed by quite wealthy leaders and politicians, claim to be the voice of the ordinary downtrodden worker. They claim to be the voice of the people against the elites. And this is a lie. The funding is coming from corporations. As I said, the leaders are wealthy, and this is an alliance of neoliberals and big businesses like Donald Trump, like Jacob Rees-Mogg with his £7 million that he's made since Brexit, with the far right as a means of galvanising political support for their further free market agendas. As we've seen, Jacob Rees-Mogg wants Brexit so he can escape the consumer protections and the workers' rights and environmental protections and standards of the European Union, and open up Britain to the private companies of the United States, and they can carve up the NHS, all of that you probably know. So how is this relevant to Islamophobia? The reason it is relevant is because instead of blaming the corporations, instead of blaming big business, instead of blaming our politicians for failing to regulate the financial sector, for failing to use money that they've used to bail out the banks, and for failing to use that money into building houses, into building schools, into building children's centres, into redressing the gross inequality that has increased since the financial crash. They failed to do that, and instead they say immigrants are to blame. They say Muslims are to blame. They say that they represent the white working class and that Muslims and immigrants are taking their jobs, they're taking their homes. It's Muslims and immigrants who are causing society to disintegrate, who are causing social tensions, who are making people lose their culture, when really it's a much more complicated thing, and it's more to do with the fact that people are in low wages, people can't find the right jobs, and because money is being shoveled up at an alarming rate to the wealthiest in society. And this is not just happening in Britain, this is happening across the globe. A great economist, Thomas Piketty, he's published a book recently and has done some research which shows across the globe, in India, in America, across Europe, the levels of inequality are greater than they've ever been before. Okay, so what's happened is that social democracies, social democratic parties, centrist parties, they're losing ground. They're losing ground to the far right, and some of them, in an effort to shore up those votes, are shifting their own political rhetoric to match the far right. So we have the Tories, who, in my opinion, have basically become UKIP. We have in France, you had Sarkozy. He started demonising immigrants and migrants in order to take away the vote that Jean-Marie Le Pen had garnered after he got to the presidential runoffs in 2002. You have Fidesz in Hungary, which is supposed to be a centrist party, which is now sitting with the Tory party in the European Parliament. That's moving to the right to try and get the votes that the even more extreme Jobbik party is taking from it. So we have these centrist parties that are actually abandoning the centre ground and moving to the right because they want to garner those votes. They don't want to lose votes, whilst also carrying on with their austerity programmes. So austerity has failed. And one of the things that these centrist parties have done, and this also applies to centrist parties across the European Union, instead of saying it was our fault, we got it wrong, austerity is a failed economic policy, we used it after the recession, and then actually our debt increased. All you have to do is look at Eurostat. European debt has increased massively since 2008. All you have to do is look at British economic data. GDP, debt to GDP ratio increased massively. Austerity has failed, and actually what it's done is it's prolonged this recession. Instead of saying, yeah, we admit it, we got it wrong, they're saying immigrants are to blame. If we get rid of all the immigrants, it'll be fine. So Islamophobia has existed for decades, but I think now it's almost been turbocharged. And research from Hope Not Hate has actually, they've released their report, State of Hate 2019, which actually shows that, and I think, Mariam, you were referencing this, it shows that of religious hate crime, which has increased, it's almost doubled since the Brexit vote, hate crime and attacks directed at Muslims has taken up about 70% or something of that vote. Basically, the large majority is actually directed to Muslims. Even though we're trying to leave the European Union, this is being directed to Muslims, and you can see that from Nigel Farage's Breaking Point poster. You know, all those faces on that poster were brown faces. You know, they're probably not the average European Union migrant. It's something else that's really going on here. Okay. And let me just turn my page. So what can we do about this? It is a depressing picture, but we must not lose hope, and we must, every single one of us in this room, galvanise and fight to change the narrative, to fight the lies that immigrants are the ones who are to blame. It's not immigrants. You know, Britain has some of the worst trade union laws. If unions recruited migrants, if unions, instead of saying, you know, we represent the working class, by that they mean the white working class, instead of saying things like migrants are cutting workers' wages, if they galvanised migrants to also fight and, you know, lobby their employers together with the rest of the working class, then that would be a good way to make sure that migrants' wages don't cut other workers' wages. It would also be a really good way to make sure that people are linked and connected, as is it Sarah? Sorry, Sarah. I'm terrible at names. Sarah, as Sarah stated, if, you know, this is a really, really meaningful way to connect and work together for something, for a meaningful gain in society. Also, social democratic parties, and I'm talking about social democratic parties, not just the Labour Party, but across Europe, in the States, they need to also stop perpetuating the myth that migrants are cutting workers' wages. You know, I am a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I support Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. However, in The Guardian recently, he wrote an article, and in that article he did refer to stopping migrants cutting workers' wages. And I think he has the best intentions, but I do feel that these kind of narratives are a little bit insidious, because if you are a worker and you hear that, and then you've got someone like a Muslim who's come next door, and then suddenly you think, they're the reason that my wages are down. They're the reason my wages are being cut. You know, that might be something that motivates someone to make a racist comment on the street, or some kind of abuse, because you blame your problems on someone else. So I understand why this is happening, because immigration is a serious and leading issue in the media today. So all politicians feel like they have to respond, and they have to look like they're being tough on migration, or at least say, you know, have some kind of response on migration. I say that response needs to be defend migrants, protect Muslims. They are not the problems, and then call out the real source of the problem, which is neoliberalism, austerity. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is migrants need to be put, and Muslims, sorry, I've broadened this out to migrants. Muslims, migrants, they need to be put at the forefront of these movements. They need to be put at the forefront of the anti-racist movement. There's a brilliant counsellor, her name is Shaista Aziz. I don't know if anyone's come across her. I heard her talk last weekend at a No Pass Around conference, and she called for decolonising the anti-racist movement. The reason why this is so important is because, firstly, it's about experience. Who knows better the experience of Muslims and migrants than them themselves? So they can bring something to the table that others may not be able to bring. Secondly, it's about, again, links and connections. If everybody in the community, no matter what their background, no matter what their faith, comes together to fight for a common cause like this, it immediately breaks down those barriers where, you know, people are suspicious of the other. People are no longer, you cannot dehumanize someone who's sitting next to you. You cannot dehumanize someone who's fighting with you for you to have better wages. You cannot dehumanize someone who's fighting with you to get better rights at work. You cannot dehumanize someone who's walking next to you, knocking on doors, telling them to vote for whichever candidate. So one of the things that, and this is a Labour Party gathering, or organised by the Labour Party, I know it's a community outreach thing. One of the things that I've found in the Labour Party quite shocking is that, you know, when I go to my branches and my constituency meetings, you know, I live in Streatham, right next to Brixton, very, very diverse area. The meetings are not that diverse. And I'm not trying to say, or I'm not trying to blame anyone, but really I think this is something we need to start looking into, because because, you know, the Muslim community or the immigrant community and the immigrant diaspora isn't politically mobilized, that is why it's so easy for politicians to bash us. That's why it's so easy for the media to bash us, because we're not politically mobilized as well as other groups might be. So that's something that's really necessary, and I really hope that if you have a Muslim friend, or not just a Muslim friend, but anyone in the community who's underrepresented in politics, I really hope that you can make the effort to try and bring them in. And I really hope that you can also make the effort in your branches and in your constituencies and in whatever organizations you're in, to think about how you can make the organization welcoming to Muslims and immigrants, how you can make it an accepting environment for them. And that might be to be able to start talking about race and issues of race, and to start political education as well amongst yourselves and your friends about race issues, and like how to be sensitive to those issues and inclusive. Do let me know if I'm rambling on. Okay. So those are really concrete things that I think we can do to change this. That's something that we can all do locally, and obviously this speech is about Europe, it's about the globe. Another thing that is very savvy about the far right and the fascists, as I would like to call them, is that they are networked across the globe. They have a lot of money and they have big networks. Steve Bannon has been going around meeting with Boris Johnson, Tommy Robinson, Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban. It's going to Poland. I met some Hungarian left activists and some Polish left activists last week. Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins are going to their countries, they're speaking at rallies, they're galvanizing hate, the discourse of hatred, they're whipping up Islamophobia, they're whipping up racism, and they're these high profile figures, and by going around the world they're building this network. In Italy, there's a guy whose name's Luca Traini. He got a gun and went on a rampage shooting migrants. He says that there's a race war. He says that Europe's Christian identity is being threatened. People in the States, far-right activists in the States, made memes about him and have been creating WhatsApp groups and online groups where they're connected with fascist activists in Italy, and they're sharing their ideas, they're sharing their tactics, and they're building their online support and they're spreading their message. So we need to be spreading our message. We need to be building our networks. We need to be recording our videos. I mean, you know, I'm gonna hopefully, if I can, get back this footage from you and try and spread it among my contacts, do something online. This is what we need to do, and we need to do it fast, because they're moving so fast, it's scary. And I'll do a little plug for something that I've been involved in, which is the No Pasaran movement. We had our conference last weekend. We're trying to build up contacts and a list of people who are interested in joining the fight against the far right. I know there might be people who support Brexit from a left-wing position, but we have the view that Brexit is a far-right project and that it needs to be fought, and the racism behind it needs to be challenged and fought. So if you agree with that, please come and join our movement, and give me your email address as well, or your number, and I'll add you to that. Also, a little shameless plug is that I've co-authored a book. It's called Creeping Fascism: What It Is and How to Fight It. I co-authored this book with the editor of the exciting military history magazine that I work on. That's another story that talk to me in person if you want to know more about that. And we basically were working, we were emailing each other. I started working a couple of years ago, and I was seeing all this mad stuff that this orange man on the cover, Donald Trump, was doing. God, I'm talking about Islamophobia and race. I hope I don't get told off for that. Okay, and we realised that we've both shared a lot of our views, so we decided that we'd collaborate together, and we wrote this book really fast because we saw how fast the far right are moving. They're moving fast. We need to act. So in the book, we pull together what we're seeing happening across countries across the globe, including India, Italy, everywhere, as much as we can, so to show that there are patterns here. We analyse what's going on from an economic perspective, and we also suggest ways that this far-right movement can be crushed. It's happened before. That we had the Anti-Nazi League in Britain. Oswald Mosley and his fascists were marching in Britain, and they were crushed too. So we can do this. So that's a whistle-stop tour of my research. How long have I talked for?
Okay, final thoughts?
Yeah. I just wanted to say and end on a positive note. Sorry?
I was saying, I'm sure we want to allow time for questions from the audience as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to end on a positive note, actually. And it's something that, Hamid, you were talking about how Islam is about trying to all the differences and all the different groups that divide us. The aim is actually to connect, or to, sorry, well, that was what you were saying. So it reminded me of a verse from the Quran that I used to be taught when I was a child, and it is, "We made you into different nations and tribes so that you may know one another." And I think that is the essence. We all need to come together. It doesn't matter if you are Muslim, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, it doesn't matter if you're Christian, if you're atheist, if you're agnostic, if you're white, if you're black, if you're lesbian, if you're gay. We all need to come together to fight this and to build a better world, because we can do it. And when people work with a politics of hate, when they demonize people, they don't just demonize one group, they demonize every single minority group, every single person who is different, everybody who is a dissident, everyone who doesn't agree with the party line. All of these groups get crushed by these kind of movements. So we must all come together and fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seema. Come join the table.